Okay, I'm going to do you a brief introduction to corpora and corpus linguistics, and this set of slides is based on material created by Harold Summers, and they're used with his permission. Harold Summers was a professor at the University of Manchester in the area of corpus linguistics. So what is a corpus? As it says on the slides, corpus equals body. It has a Latin root and it has a plural then. Corpora, it's used, the plural that we use is the Latin plural rather than saying corpuses. And it basically means a collection of text, and they can be written text, most commonly written text, but also it can be transcribed speech. So some corpora consist only of text, and some consist only of speech, and some have a mixture. And usually it's purposefully collected, so people collect it for a reason. They want to create a corpus of a certain type, and it's usually structured in some kind of way. So they're taking certain text, so from certain sort of parts of time or whatever it happens to be. And it's usually, but not always, annotated. So annotated basically means that you add extra elements to the text, showing the linguistic markers, so that you can actually search, in an annotated text, you can search for all determiners, for example, or certain types of determiners, because they're all labelled in a certain kind of way. And they're usually stored these days on and accessible through computers. And so, as it says at the bottom there, it's basically a text archive, so a collection of material that's brought together and used for analysis. So historically, it's corpora are not a new thing. They've been around quite a while, and they've been used for the manual analysis of large amounts of text. For example, analysis of Shakespeare, looking for his use of colour words, for example, or other kinds of words, looking at the way different plays are written. So is The Tempest written by the same person as Hamlet? You're probably well aware that Shakespeare, there are lots of questions about whether Shakespeare was one person or many. And it's also used for sort of looking at biblical texts as well. The problem with that way of doing it, the older way of doing it pre-computers, was that it was prone to errors, and it was also very time consuming. Imagine actually working through a Shakespeare text and counting the number of times he uses the colour purple, for example. And it's very difficult then to check in any meaningful way, because then somebody else would also have to go through the text and also count the number of times that he uses purple. Very, very, very time consuming. So computers have introduced reliability, accuracy, and replicability. Sorry, it's much faster to do it. You can have much bigger corpora. And you've got new tools for analysis. The concordancing software that we're going to use, for example, is one example. So Harold Summers suggests here that corpus linguistics is not a specific branch of linguistics. It's not a theory. It's a set of tools that we use to explore things like sociolinguistics and psycholinguistics. So we can use corpora to explore second language acquisition. We can look at the way that we can collect a set of spoken language, and we can explore that through a corpus as well. A student here at Manchester, was actually a colleague for a while. He looked at the way that Polish people spoke English, and he looked at that from a sociolinguistic perspective. So he interviewed Polish speakers of English, did an analysis, and wrote his thesis based on that. So it's corpus linguistics is a tool, basically. But what it does do, what a corpus does, is provide real understanding of how language is used at a particular moment in time. So we can actually look at it. If we've got text, historical text, we can look at how language was used at a certain period of history. And it contrasts with that kind of very introspective approach that was often very typical in terms of language analysis, sitting there thinking about examples, the kind of thing that we see teachers doing on a regular basis in classrooms. When I was younger and worked overseas, I worked in Azerbaijan and I worked in their dictionary department. And one of my jobs was to think of examples of the use of language, and it was jolly difficult because quite often the ideas I came up with were not the ones that they wanted. They wanted examples of things that I just didn't know how it worked, and I didn't have access to the internet or a large store, a large library of text or anything to explore. So very difficult for me to find examples sometimes for the things that they were looking for. It relates to the relationship between our latent knowledge of language, if you like, our competence, and the actual way that we use language. So often we say language is used in a certain kind of way, these words are used in a certain kind of way, but actually when we explore the language we find that there's a difference. Corpus linguists are looking for trends, sort of changes over time in language. And they're interested in probabilities and not certainties. So they're not necessarily rule governed. And there are lots of stories of the way that actual corpus evidence, contradicts our assumptions about how language is used, and the difference between, different bits of language that we insist, actually categorically works in this kind of way. And when we look at it in a corpus, we find actually we weren't right at all. So be prepared to find evidence of that. So what does corpus linguistics do? People design and compile corpora. They develop tools for analysis. Descriptive linguists use them to analyze lexical and grammatical behavior of language. For example, making dictionaries. I've always talked a little bit about dictionaries. And for increasingly these days, you find that these kinds of corpora are used for constructing course books as well. So most of the big publishers these days have a corpus, and they use that in the creation of materials. As it says there, exploiting corpora in applied linguistics, language teaching and translation. I mean, we've explored some of the uses in language teaching, and of course, you can use it to help you translate as well. I've mentioned that corpus linguistics has, a history in looking at Shakespeare and the Bible, but of course, as we've said, computers in the 1950s changed all of that and made it very, very easy to do. So the first modern corpus, if you like, computer readable one, was what's called the Brown corpus, and as it says there, has 1 million words of American English, printed in 1961, comes from different types of text, and was used as a model for quite a lot of other later corpora. And you see one of the issues here is that the fact that this was collected in 1961, and it was collected in 1961. It wasn't then collected again in 1971, 1981, and so on and so forth. It was just exists now as a kind of historical record. Although, of course, they could go through the same process and collect, a new corpus in 2016. So the Lancaster, Oslo, and Bergen corpus, what's called the Lob corpus, again, that was a British English one, and similar in many ways to Brown, or based on Brown. There's a corpus of Indian English that was very similar as well. Now, not everybody thinks that corpus linguistics is a good idea, and Chomsky was quite critical of corpus linguistics. He thought that the idea was that we're looking at limited amounts of language, whereas as far as he was concerned, language was finite. Every time, his famous idea was that every time we utter something new, whereas actually when you look at language from a corpus perspective, you begin to question, seriously question whether that's the case. So using a limited corpus actually has its weaknesses, and of course it does, and that's where computing has made such a difference, because we can have so much bigger corpora, and we can make better use of them. So there are other corpora, the London Lund corpus of spoken English. So that was the first corpus of transcribed spoken language, and led to the beginnings of our better understanding of the way that spoken language works. You've probably heard of CoBuild. Again, large corpus, 1 million words, and it was based around the work of John Sinclair, who you'll find discussed in the materials. Very important person connected with language development. Move on to the British National Corpus, and this is a tagged corpus, as it says there, with lots of tools available. Lots and lots of language, but of course dated, like all of these, and it was originally used, for just local work, but at Oxford. But now it's available nationally. Of course, you have to pay for it, but it's there, and it's probably one of the most recent ones that you can get at. And we could go on. I mean, there's Cambridge have their own corpus as well, and you'll see that people like Michael McCarthy, for example, and Ronald Carter, who are co-authors on the Cambridge book From Corpus to Classroom, they use a lot of material they use a lot of material from the corpora to do their investigations. So that's it. That's a basic introduction, a little bit of history, and brings us to where we are now, and what we're going to go on and look at in terms of collecting our own corpus and beginning to analyse it in certain kinds of ways.